All right, diving into Middle Eastern meteorology today. Got some really fascinating material you sent over, an excerpt from, let me see, Tropical Meteorology, Middle East Meteorology by H.M. Hassanian. And honestly, ready to get past those, stereotypical images of just endless deserts when it comes to this region.
Yeah, it's a little oversimplified, isn't it, that whole image? The Middle East, definitely not a meteorological monolith, that's for sure.
Not a monolith. Okay. So while it's easy to picture, I guess, the entire area is just one big hot desert, you're saying the reality is what? A lot more interesting.
Much more nuanced, yeah. You've got the Mediterranean climate, right, categorized as Kisa, which, as you know, is known for those hot, dry summers and the wetter winters. But the thing is, even within that, the transitions, they can be shockingly sharp.
Sharp. Okay. How sharp are we talking?
Well, picture this. You could be traveling along, let's say, the 40th parallel north, and within just 400 kilometers, you go from a scorching desert landscape, right, to cool, mountainous highlands.
Really?
Okay.
It's within 400 kilometers. Okay, so that's a huge swing in scenery, obviously, but in climate, too, over such a short distance. Not what you typically picture. Now, the source mentioned something called the Kamazine wind. Is that one of those, regional variations you're talking about?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. The Kamazine, it's a major player in the region's meteorology, for sure. It's this powerful, hot, dry wind, and it picks up, tons of dust as it blows across the Sahara Desert, mostly affecting Egypt. Imagine winds up to 140 kilometers an hour.
140 kilometers an hour? That's intense.
Strong enough to seriously disrupt daily life, damage crops, even mess with the air quality.
Wow, 140 kilometers an hour. That's hard to even fathom. It makes you think about how people in the past dealt with these conditions. Would something like that impact, I don't know, ancient trade routes, things like that?
Oh, absolutely. You're spot on to connect it to history like that. The Kamazine definitely left its mark. I mean, there's evidence that those winds, they messed with ancient Egyptian sailing routes on the Nile, for example.
Oh, kidding.
Oh, yeah. When the Kamazine kicked up, it could bring shipping traffic to a standstill. So, yeah, trade, travel, everything affected for quite a while.
Wow. Talk about a force of nature shaping history. And the source mentioned other regional winds, too, right? It's not just the Kamazine that's making things interesting.
Oh, no, not at all. The Middle East has, a whole collection of these winds, each with its own, personality. You've got the Simoon in Iran, famous for its intense heat. And then there's the Ghibli in Libya, known for these sudden, violent gusts. They all bring their own challenges to the region.
It really highlights how much these natural forces have shaped not just the physical geography, but even the cultures and history of the Middle East.
Yeah.
Speaking of impactful weather systems, the excerpt also talked about the monsoon and how it's connected to the Arabian Peninsula. Now, I have to admit, when I hear monsoon, I go straight to picturing torrential downpours. Is that accurate for the Middle East, though?
Not quite. It's funny, that whole torrential rain thing, it's a pretty common misunderstanding when it comes to monsoons.
Oh, really? So it's not all about the rain, then?
Well, they do bring rain, but it's more accurate to think of it as a seasonal wind shift. In fact, the word monsoon, it actually comes from the Arabic word for season.
Huh. I never knew that. So how does that work in the Middle East?
Okay, so picture it like this. You've got the summer monsoon. What happens is it pulls in this hot, moist air all the way from the Indian Ocean right towards the Arabian Peninsula's interior. And this air, it rises, which leads to, some rainfall, but the main event here, it's the shift in wind direction.
Okay, so it's like a wind reversal, almost. That's fascinating.
Exactly. And then when you get to winter, the monsoon is a total 180. This time the wind's coming from the south, blowing off the land, and usually that means drier conditions overall.
So it's like this double whammy of wind hitting the Arabian Peninsula, each season with its own, distinct flavor. And with all this talk about crazy winds, I can't help but think about those insane pictures you see of Middle Eastern dust storms. Are those a direct result of these monsoon winds we're talking about?
They're definitely connected, yeah. I mean, the monsoon winds, they set up these larger atmospheric patterns, right? But those mega dust storms you're thinking of, those are often triggered by something a bit more specific, usually a low-pressure system moving in over the dry terrain.
Okay, so break that down for me. How do these low-pressure systems actually whip up those incredible dust clouds?
All right, imagine this. You've got this low-pressure system, right? And it's moving over the desert. Now, that low pressure, it acts kind of like a vacuum, It starts pulling in air from the areas around it. And because we're talking about the desert, that air, it's scooping up all that loose dust and sand. That creates this giant swirling cloud.
Wow, so the lower the pressure, the bigger the dust storm.
Pretty much. The stronger the wind that comes with that low pressure system, the more intense that dust storm's going to be. It's pretty straightforward when you think about it.
It's kind of wild, though, right? To think that something we can't even see, like air pressure, can create these huge, almost apocalyptic-looking events. Now, the source material mentioned that the Middle East, it actually gives Africa a run for its money when it comes to dust storm frequency, which is a lot of dust. Is there a particular reason why this region seems so susceptible to them?
It's a great question. It's not just about wind. It's more like this perfect storm, so to speak. You've got these massive stretches of desert, tons of material for the storms to work with. Plus, the region sits right at the intersection of a bunch of major wind systems, like we've been talking about. And then, on top of all that, you have to factor in things like deforestation and overgrazing, which are making the soil even more vulnerable to erosion.
Right, so it's this combination of natural and, let's face it, human-caused factors. Makes you think. Now, we've been talking about regional winds and those low-pressure systems, but are there, like, even bigger forces at play here? Global forces that affect the Middle East's climate. So it's this whole combination of things, these dust storms, fascinating stuff. But I got to ask, we've been talking about the regional winds, right, and those low pressure systems, but are there like even bigger forces at play, global ones, I mean, that affect how the climate works in the Middle East?
You're totally on the right track thinking globally. Those larger forces, they definitely have a say in things. One of the biggest players is something called the North Atlantic Oscillation. We call it the NAO for short.
The North Atlantic Oscillation. Okay. That sounds like it should be impacting, I don't know, weather in the North Atlantic. How does that even affect somewhere as far away as the Middle East?
Good point. It does sound kind of counterintuitive, right? But the NAO, it's a perfect example of how interconnected everything is on this planet, weather-wise, I mean. Basically, what's happening is you've got this fluctuation in air pressure. It's between the Icelandic low and the Azores high. Those are two pressure systems in the North Atlantic.
Gotcha.
And when the difference in that pressure between those two systems, when it's big, we call that a positive NAO phase. Well, that can make the wind patterns change in a way that reaches all the way over to the Middle East.
Seriously? Wow. So what does that actually look like, I mean, in the Middle East when that happens?
Well, if you have a high NAO index in winter, it often lines up with drier conditions in parts of the Middle East.
Wild. Okay, so that's the NAO. Any other, like, global heavy hitters I should know about?
Oh, for sure. Can't forget about the El Niño Southern Oscillation, right? Or ENSO, for short.
Right, ENSO. Heard of that.
Well, you've probably heard of El Niño at least.
Right.
That's the warm phase of ENSO. And those El Niño events, they tend to weaken the Indian monsoon. And we already talked about how important the monsoon is to the Middle East's rainfall. So weaker monsoon generally means less rain for them.
Makes sense. Okay, so if El Niño weakens the Indian monsoon, does that mean that La Niña, which I think is a cool phase, right? Does that mean La Niña brings more rain to the Middle East?
Exactly. La Niña events often mean a stronger Indian monsoon. More rain for the Middle East, generally speaking, at least in some areas. It's kind of crazy how these ocean patterns happening way over there can have such a big impact on the other side of the world.
It really is, and so complex. I had no idea.
And those are just two of the big ones, really. Even things like where the subtropical jet stream is, especially in the winter, that can really affect things too, like the temperature and how much rain falls across the Middle East.
This has been, wow, a serious education on just how much is going on with weather in the Middle East.
Yeah.
It's incredible. You know, you think about local weather, but it really is all part of this giant global system, isn't it?
It really is. It all ties together, doesn't it?
Totally does. Makes you think differently about checking the forecast, that's for sure.
I know, right? It makes you appreciate just how complex, but also how interconnected everything is on this planet. It's amazing when you think about it. We've just scratched the surface, of course, talking about Middle Eastern meteorology, but I hope this is at least giving you a little taste of just how diverse the climate is over there and all the powerful forces, both local and global, that shape it.
It totally has.
Oh!
Really puts things in perspective, that's for sure.
Thanks for the deep dive, fascinating stuff as always.